According to new bombshell testimony from a Secret Service agent who was on the ground at the JFK assassination, well, it turns out that the Warren Commission's report, meaning the U.S. government's official narrative about what happened that day, well, you can say it has a few holes in it. In fact, the testimony of this particular Secret Service agent, who just spoke out for the first time in 60 years, it refutes a key claim of the government regarding the so-called magic bullet. Now, specifically, Mr. Paul Landis, who was only a few feet away from JFK when he got shot, gave an interview to the New York Times, published just 5 days ago. And in the interview, Mr. Landis, who was the Secret Service agent assigned to protect Ms. Jacqueline Kennedy, he told his side of the story. And according to him, according to Mr. Landis, who was again just several feet away from JFK when he got shot, he recalls hearing multiple gunshots at the time of the assassination, saying this, quote, "At the first shot, Mr. Landis turned to look over his right shoulder in the direction of the sound, but spotted nothing. Then he turned to the limousine and saw Kennedy raising his arms, evidently hit. Suddenly, Mr. Landis noticed that Mr. Hill, who is another Secret Service agent, had leapt off their follow-up car and was sprinting toward the limousine. Mr. Landis thought about doing the same, but he did not have an angle. He said he heard a second shot that sounded louder, and finally the fatal third shot that hit Kennedy in the head. Mr. Landis had to duck to avoid being splattered by flesh and brain matter. He knew instantly that the president was dead." Then, after they reached the hospital, Mr. Landis, who was by this point in the limousine with the president, he claims to have found the bullet right there in the back seat. Quote, "Once they reached the hospital, Mr. Hill and Mr. Landis coaxed the distraught First Lady to let go of her husband so he could be taken inside. After they exited the car, Mr. Landis noticed 2 bullet fragments in a pool of bright red blood. He fingered one of them, but put it back. That's when he said he noticed the intact bullet in the seam of the tufted dark leather cushioning. He said he slipped it into his coat pocket and headed into the hospital, where he planned to give it to a supervisor, but in the confusion instinctively put it on Kennedy's stretcher instead." However, with that out of the way, the reason that this small detail about the stretcher, about the president's stretcher, is so important is because one of the main reasons that the magic bullet theory has been so widely accepted is because the bullet was allegedly discovered on the stretcher of the Texas governor, Mr. John Connally. And so the official government explanation, as put forth by the Warren Commission 60 years ago, has been that there was only one shooter, Mr. Lee Harvey Oswald, who fired 3 bullets, one of which was able to strike and kill President Kennedy before also going on to strike Governor Connally in multiple different places. Now, I'm sure that most people watching this already know about the conclusion of the Warren report, but just in case someone watching this doesn't, here's a quick summary. Quote, "According to the Warren Commission, Lee Harvey Oswald fired 3 shots in 8.6 seconds. The first shot missed. The second shot, however, had a wild trajectory. Quote, the second shot struck President Kennedy in the back, exited through his throat, and then that same bullet continued to hit Texas Governor John Connally, entering at his right shoulder, striking his rib, exited under his right nipple, continued through his wrist, and then going into his left thigh. That is, if nothing else, an incredible shot. And it's also exactly why skeptics of this theory have been referring to it as the magic bullet. Quote, it seemed incredible that a single bullet could do all that, so skeptics called it the magic bullet theory. Investigators came to that conclusion, partly because the bullet was found on a stretcher believed to have held Mr. Connally at Parkland Memorial Hospital, so they assumed it had exited his body during efforts to save his life. But Mr. Landis, who was never interviewed by the Warren Commission, said that is not what happened. And so, getting back to the interview, according to the testimony of the Secret Service agent, it was him who discovered the pristine-looking bullet, and he found it right there in the back seat of the limo, right next to where President Kennedy was sitting. Then, in order to prevent the bullet from getting lost in the fray or from getting snatched up by some souvenir-seeking bystander, Mr. Landis allegedly placed it in his pocket and then later on the stretcher belonging to President Kennedy. Quote, when Mr. Landis spotted the bullet after the motorcade arrived at the hospital, he said he grabbed it to thwart souvenir hunters. Then, for reasons that still seem fuzzy even to him, he said he entered the hospital and placed it next to Kennedy on the president's stretcher, assuming it could somehow help doctors figure out what happened. At some point, he now guesses, the stretchers must have been pushed together and the bullet was shaken from one to another. Now again, this one little detail is crucial. The fact that Mr. Landis placed the bullet on the stretcher of the president. Because again, one of the main selling points of the magic bullet theory has always been the alleged fact that the magic bullet was discovered on the stretcher of Governor Connally. But according to the Secret Service agent, it was actually him who found the bullet in the back seat of the limo right next to where the president was sitting. he took it all the way into the hospital before placing it on the stretcher of the president. And then, at least allegedly, this is what took place afterwards. Quote, "The hospital's senior engineer later found it," meaning the bullet, "when he was moving Mr. Connolly's stretcher, by then empty, and bumped it against another stretcher in the hall, resulting in the bullet falling out." And the rest, as they say, is history. And the reason that this all matters so much is the fact that this testimony, it very obviously casts even more doubt on the idea that there was just one shooter on that fateful day. Because according to the investigation that was undertaken after the assassination, based on the type of rifle that Lee Harvey Oswald used to shoot at the moving car, it was somewhere between unlikely to impossible for him to have had enough time to shoot the president, reload, and then shoot again. And so, if Governor Connolly was indeed shot by a second or maybe even a third bullet in a matter of just a few seconds, that would very likely mean that there was at least one other shooter somewhere out there in the crowd, perhaps on the grassy knoll. Now, what's interesting is that you fast forward 60 years, and among the frontrunners of the current 2024 presidential election, the two main frontrunners, they likely know exactly what happened. That's because, by now, all of the JFK assassination-related government documents, they should have been all declassified. In fact, according to the JFK Assassination Records Collection Act that was passed by Congress back in 1992, all the records should have been released by October of 2017. However, interestingly, if you remember, back then, President Trump chose to declassify most of the documents, but he wound up acquiescing to pressure from within the government, particularly from Mike Pompeo, who was formerly the director of the CIA, to not release everything. Then, 4 years later, Joe Biden also released more JFK-related records, but then he, too, decided not to release everything. At this point, around 99% of the records have allegedly been released, but for some odd reason, the U.S. government is holding on to those remaining 1% of documents with an, you can say, iron grip. Now, why exactly that isn't clear. For his part, 2 months ago, President Trump published this statement while on the campaign trail. Quote, "When I return to the White House, I will declassify and unseal all JFK assassination-related documents. It's been 60 years. Time for the American people to know the truth." Now, theoretically, he could just tell us what's in those documents. But I guess the strategy is that the American people have to re-elect him and hope that this time he will release the documents. For his part, Joe Biden has yet to make such a campaign promise, although it wouldn't have to be a campaign promise for his part. He could just do it whenever he feels like it. Regardless, in terms of what these documents likely reveal, well, another contender for the 2024 presidential election and a nephew of JFK, Mr. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., he recently spoke on the topic of the assassination, saying this, quote, "There is overwhelming evidence that the CIA was involved in his murder. I think it's beyond a reasonable doubt at this point. The evidence is overwhelming that the CIA was involved in the murder and in the cover-up." And so the mystery remains. Although now we have another data point, which, if you believe his testimony at least, shows that the magic bullet was not discovered in the governor's stretcher, but rather it was discovered in the back seat of the limousine where President Kennedy was sitting and shot. If you'd like to read the full testimony from Mr. Landis, I'll throw a link to it. It'll be right there in the description box below this video for you to check out at your own leisure. And then actually, I'd love to know your thoughts. Do you think that there was just one single lone gunman who was responsible for the assassination? Or do you think that perhaps there were several gunmen? And also, do you believe that the CIA was involved in any way with what happened? And if so, why do you think they were? What was the reason? I mean, you're probably well aware that there have been recently declassified documents showing that in the months leading up to the assassination, U.S. intelligence agencies were keeping tabs on Lee Harvey Oswald, again, in the months before he shot JFK. They were taking photos of him at the Soviet embassy, and they have even went so far as to actually record his private phone calls. There was even a memo that was put out by J. Edgar Hoover himself in his official capacity back then as the director of the FBI, which reported that Lee Harvey Oswald had threatened to kill JFK during his trip to Mexico City, which was just 3 weeks before the actual assassination in Dallas. And so what do you make of all that? Was that just a failure of the intelligence agencies not taking this threat seriously enough? Or were they perhaps pulling the strings behind the scenes? And then lastly, what do you make of the CIA pushing President Trump so hard to not release the remaining JFK files? I mean, realistically, after 60 years, almost everyone involved in this affair is either dead or they're in their 90s. So why would they still be hiding those remaining 1% of documents? I'd love to know your thoughts. Please leave them in the comments section below. I'll be reading them later tonight as well as into the week. And then until next time, I'm your host, Roman from the Epoch Times. Stay informed, and most importantly, stay free.